All right, we'll go ahead and kick this off. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm Colleen Horonchek. I'm a policy analyst with the Cato Institute Center for Educational Freedom and also a homeschooling mom. Originally, we were calling this a private event, but we did end up opening up to the public a bit. So thank you everyone for being here. A little bit about what prompted me to put this together. As a homeschooling mom, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of the concerns that homeschoolers have when it comes to ESAs. And I typically have just gone with what I call the Hillsdale College approach, which is, just don't take the money if you don't want the strings that come with it. My daughter just graduated from Hillsdale College, so maybe that's why that's the approach I call it. But it really wasn't enough to calm fears in a lot of cases. And it was actually last year at the Kennesaw State Hybrid School Conference that Mike Donnelly, who's on our panel, told me about the approach that a lot of states have taken where they separate the homeschoolers, the traditional homeschoolers, from recipients, ESA recipients who are educating their kids at home. And that seemed like a great solution to me. And so I was just kind of figuring that a lot of states would go that way. Earlier this year, I noticed a couple of states were still having those battles with homeschoolers, specifically Florida and Georgia. I saw it. And it made me realize we need a broader conversation to talk things through and to talk about this approach, make sure people are aware of it, how can it be best utilized, and then other things that are kind of new in the world that are other ways to alleviate the fears of homeschoolers while still making sure that families who want to access these funds that are meant for educating their kids, that they can use them in a variety of ways. So I'm really happy to be joined today by, I think it's going to be a great panel. We've got, as I mentioned, Mike Donnelly. He was formerly senior counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and now vice president at the Yes Every Kid Foundation. Matt Bienberg is director of education policy at the Goldwater Institute in Arizona. Jamie Buckland is a West Virginia homeschooler and founder of West Virginia, the Families United for Education, which has a long history of working on various homeschool issues there. And West Virginia did use this approach in their Hope Scholarship ESA. And John England, who is a homeschool dad and education policy analyst at the Libertas Institute in Utah, where their recent ESA also uses this approach. So we're going to kick it off with Mike, who's going to give us a brief overview of how homeschoolers have viewed school choice in the past. And I think really he'll be able to set the stage for us. So Michael, there you go.
Thanks, Colleen. It's so exciting to be here with everyone. Hope everybody's having a wonderful day. And it's been a privilege for me to serve the homeschool community as an HSLDA attorney and now working at the Yes Every Kid Foundation, where we're really seeking to facilitate and support the transformation of education in our country. I think everyone knows that we need to do something differently. And I think that's what's motivating the ESAs. And boy, we've had some amazing momentum. When you look around the country, you see, I think, 5 or 6 states have passed ESAs in the last few months. Iowa, Arkansas, Florida expanding, and it's creating quite a stir. Roy Cooper, the North Carolina governor, yesterday declared a state of emergency. I don't know if he actually declared a state of emergency, but he called it an emergency because the legislature is set to pass an ESA. And he's saying this is terrible for public education. But we're here to talk about homeschoolers and ESAs, and whether you support them or not, the reality is that the homeschool community has concerns about the education savings account policy. Why is that? Serving the homeschool community for many years, I've had a front row seat to that. I've been involved in designing policy, advocating for what Colleen and I talked about last year, the Great Compromise. Colleen wanted to call this webinar the Great Compromise, and I said, I don't know, is it really a compromise, Colleen? A compromise is usually when one side gives up something, right? Or both sides give up something to get something greater. And when we talk about designing policy that meets the homeschoolers' concerns, I'm not sure there's much of a compromise here. So let's back up a little bit. Why is it that the homeschool community, not all, but many in the homeschool community, oppose education savings accounts? It comes down to something very simple. What the government funds, the government controls. You may have heard some of the phrases: with government shekels come government shackles, with government coin comes government control. Some people, are concerned that the ESAs are, I don't believe this, but some people are even advancing the idea that ESAs are another way for government to take over education. Well, whether that's intentional or not, what the government funds, the government can control. And so the homeschool community, most of the homeschool community, HSLDA, don't want that kind of control. The homeschool community has fought very hard over the last 40 years to realize freedom to exercise what you might say is the ultimate in school choice, which is just saying, no, goodbye, we're not going to have anything to do with the schools anymore. We're going to take it on ourselves. Most states have pretty reasonable regulations, although not all. And the homeschool community fought very hard over many years. For many years, homeschooling was not a recognized legal exception to compulsory attendance laws. And over the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the homeschool community engaged in some very significant legislative and court battles to realize this freedom. And they believe that, with a lot of money coming into the space, that could create pressure, regulatory pressure, and impose additional regulations on the homeschool community. As Colleen said, well, just don't take the money. Is it that simple? If you say, well, homeschoolers can choose whether or not they want to take the money and then no longer be subject to any regulations that might come with ESAs, is that enough? Well, the concerns are this. In some places, homeschooling can be easily confused by local government officials. So, for example, in West Virginia, and Jamie will talk about this a little bit, but in West Virginia, homeschoolers notify the local superintendents if they're going to homeschool. Well, if you've got homeschoolers getting government money and homeschoolers who are not getting government money, they can be confused. And I can tell you, having served the homeschool community across the country for 20 years, it doesn't take a lot to confuse public school, government school officials and education officials when it comes to homeschooling. All right. And so it can create problems on the ground for homeschoolers. But even in states where you don't have to notify, the state level officials can be confused. And over time, the concern is that, these homeschoolers are submitting to these regulations. Why don't we just apply that to everybody? Wouldn't that be fair? Well, we don't think that would be fair. And we the private homeschoolers who aren't taking the money, don't want that kind of pressure building on additional regulations being imposed. So confusion, what kind of homeschooler are you? Conflation, you're all homeschoolers. Some are getting the money, some aren't getting the money. Over time, this can create regulatory creep. And so, the homeschool, HSLDA and the homeschool community, we've taken a long view. We're like, look, there's a solution to this problem that doesn't prevent the good intentions of those who want ESAs, which is to help people make more choices and have more options to educate their kids. I mean, having worked at HSLDA for almost 17 years, no one in HSLDA wants to prevent parents from leaving the public school system and doing something different. We just want to protect the homeschooling community from regulatory capture. And so what we did was, we didn't do this actually, the school choice community actually came up with this approach, and Matt can talk about that in Arizona. But back in 2016, 2017, Rob Enlow and I, Rob Enlow of School of Ed Choice, talked about this, and we said, look, if we do this, will this work? And, the HSLDA and Ed Choice came up with this idea of, look, if we separate homeschoolers out from the ESA, is that enough for HSLDA to not actively oppose the legislation? And that was we agreed to do that. We said, look, if we'll take this approach, you create a separate compulsory school attendance option that's for ESA students. And you say, if you want to homeschool, you can homeschool. If you want to get an ESA, you can get an ESA, and you keep them separate. That satisfied the concerns of HSLDA and the homeschool community. And so, in West Virginia, New Hampshire, they did that. This past year, a number of states have done that. But as Colleen mentioned, a couple of states didn't do that. And that sparked the homeschool community to oppose. Why was that? Well, we'll talk about that. I'll just wrap up my comments here with, if you want to pass an ESA easily, seek out the homeschool community in your state, talk to the HSLDA attorneys who are responsible for advocating in your state before you actually release language. I don't know if there's any state legislators listening, or if you have influence with state legislators, but if you bring people together beforehand, and I can tell you that the homeschool community will tell you what will satisfy their concerns, and then we won't have fights over this. I think we'll have fewer fights. I can't say we won't have any, but we'll have fewer fights during the legislative season. So I'll just stop there. Look forward to having further conversation.
Great, thanks, Mike. As Mike mentioned, in Arizona, they've been using this approach longer. And although I hadn't heard of it till last year, Matt Bienberg, who's our next panelist, explained to me that they've actually done it there since 2012. So, Matt, if you want to just give a little bit about the history of that in Arizona, how that came about, how it's working, that would be great.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Colleen, for hosting. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and Mike. Yeah, echo much of what Mike just said, if not all. I think he laid that out really well. And so, as Colleen said, so I'm the Education Policy Director of the Goldwater Institute here in Arizona, where we have the honor of saying, we were the state that actually pioneered the first ESA program back in 2011. And so at that point, there was no such thing as an ESA. We call it an empowerment scholarship account here. Obviously, it's different things in different states, but at the end of the day, the first ESA program was essentially a policy idea. It was an experiment back in 2011 to say, hey, we want to make sure every family has access to an education. They're not constrained to go through the public school system, et cetera, or left, as so many families have been, to say, well, they're going to have to make those sacrifices entirely on their own, right? The families who are paying property taxes, they're investing into the system that's going to every other family, and yet then they're told, well, great, now you get to also pay again for your own kids, right? And so, just as a simple issue of equality and fairness for those families, this says, look, there's no reason we should be essentially making you a second-class citizen and penalizing you for saying what the offerings of the public school don't meet the needs of my family, whether it's academically, whether it's culturally, religiously, whatever it may be, to say that there is no reason they should be essentially penalized for this. So the Arizona program, which again started back in 2011, initially was just for students with special education. That's expanded over the years, and obviously last year opened up to every student. But as Colleen mentioned, the second year, so the program first started that 2011-2012 school year, had 100 kids in it, right? Again, very, very small. This was a kind of a national pilot program. And ever since then, the legislature has been refining and making some changes to it. And in the second year of the program, they went in and, exactly to Mike's point, said, all right, we've now created this program for these kids to recognize and make sure this is something that does not cause that sort of, regulatory creep, et cetera. As Mike alluded to, we're going to create 2 tracks. So just as he said, Arizona has, essentially mandatory compulsory attendance laws. It says every student in the state has to be provided instruction, but we are explicitly going to make a carve out that says for families who want to do homeschool, they sign an affidavit, essentially a written sworn statement saying, I've got my kids taken care of. They're learning what they need to know. Leave me alone, essentially, when it comes to, kind of government intrusion on here. And that's obviously worked for those families for a long time. With the ESA program, it said, okay, now we have an option where we want to not only taxpayer money is going to the public schools over here, families are going to private schools over here. We want to make sure that regardless of the form, whether it's at-home education or at a private school or tutoring, whatever it is, we're going to give that option to all of them. But we are not going to undercut, we're not going to undermine, we're not going to muddle this issue of the rights that have been secured for homeschool families. And so it said, you have an option to go to the traditional public school system, or you can do signing this affidavit for homeschoolers, or as a separate legal category, now you can sign a contract to join this ESA program where you will be given this funding, essentially your tax dollars coming back to you that you then get to deploy for your family and for your kids. Now, the Arizona statute is very clear, right? It says the government, the state does not have the authority to alter the curriculum or creed or regulate private or homeschool education, right? It is very crystal clear, right? Because this is one of the concerns that comes up a lot. Does this mean that they get to dictate the curriculum, or that they can say you're not allowed to use a religiously affiliated textbook? None of that is there. And it's very clear that says this is not the state just does not have the authority to do that. And so there are entities, we at Goldwater are a policy and also a litigation, outfit. And so there is very a strong wall there that says this is a program that is for these students, and it does not give a green light for the state to come in and start doing that. So I'm happy to kind of talk a little bit more as we go on this, but yeah, I would just, echo some of the comments to say this is something that over the now 12-year history of Arizona, we have seen the ESA program be something that's used by families, at-home education, at private school education. And it's something that, to Mike's point about the confusion of, well, are taxpayer dollars allowed to be used for this? The way the program works is it says, if you get onto it, you're essentially given this account, for a typical student without special needs or not in kindergarten, about $7,000. You use those funds for specific things. If you want to spend anything on your student outside of that, you still can, right? So it's not like saying once you sign up for the ESA program, now the government gets to decide everything you spend money on. The purchases made with those funds have, categories that they can be spent on, tutoring, curriculum, books, et cetera. But you're still, obviously, you don't give up your right to spend out of pocket on anything else that you want, just as a student who chooses not to participate. And then one last thing, I think one of the benefits for families, as opposed to what you see with federal programs where, we see college, right? Federal handouts and it increases the cost of college. With the ESA program, it gives families the funds and says, you know what, if you don't use it all, you're not maybe spending it all at a private school, or you're holding on to it, or you're educating your kids, but you're actually incentivized to economize. You're incentivized to use the sources as you need, because they roll over year to year. So you don't have, it's not just a use it or lose it. Here's $7,000 and it's April. Now go, spend a bunch of money because you might as well. No, that money is going to carry on to the next year. And families who are doing home education can take that, and if they still have funds at the end, they can put that toward college. So a student who's, considering a Hillsdale, at that point, right? It's a family they've dutifully paid their taxes. They have asked nothing of folks in return. They're now being able to be brought into this fold, get the funding, and do this. And so whether a family chooses to say, you know what, no, thank you, I'm happy to stay on just the homeschool definition, or yes, I'm interested in doing the ESA. As Mike said, I don't see it as a compromise. I do see it as a win-win for families who are not wanting to get involved with the traditional public school system.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I think that the rollover provision is a really crucial part of a good policy. So next up, we've got Jamie Buckland, who's going to talk about West Virginia's experience adopting the ESA. And I know that she has a lot to say about this. So Jamie.
Thank you, Colleen, and for all of you who are on today to learn more about this topic. And she's right. This is one of my favorite things in this day and age to talk about, because I think that we have a real opportunity in this school choice space to continue to expand school choice options without it being at the expense of traditional homeschoolers. So I'm going to make a couple of points. That's kind of my approach, is to be extremely reductive, and then we can flesh it out. Moving on, not necessarily brief, just reductive, but I'm going to aim for the brevity as well. But we've heard a lot about why this is great with Mike and Matt talking about why you would carve them out. Now, in true Jamie fashion, I'm going to tell you what also are the cons with that, and what we actually create, which could be a little chaotic by carving out, and how we can address those. So as Mike alluded to, there are really, several reasons why traditional homeschoolers want carved out. I've reduced those down into 3. The first one being that traditional homeschoolers in many states, West Virginia is one, they want to continue to expand and protect homeschool freedoms. And they can't necessarily do that if you attach a sidecar to them. So if you attach ESA funded families to traditional homeschool code, now they're going to have this sidecar, and that's going to weigh them down, if you will, when it comes time to continue to expand and protect on specific homeschool freedoms. Because as Mike said, these are families that have fought for decades to basically secede from the government and to say, we're not asking anything of you. And so we want to be sure that we keep them protected by carving them out. Secondly, with the government funding, there does need to be some accountability. We could debate to what degree that is, but some accountability, some regulation in order to even get these policies passed, right? There has to be some measures and provisions that are added into the policy to ensure that families are responsible with their funding and educating their children. And so one thing to mention in West Virginia, the actual distinction, I guess the notable distinction between traditional homeschoolers, of which I am one. I'm planning out my 17th year of homeschooling. I have 2 homeschool graduates, an 11-year-old, and my 6-year-old is a Hope Scholar. So I get to speak in the first person plural for both groups, because I have been traditionally homeschooling and I do have an ESA homeschooler. But when it comes to the submission of assessments, traditional homeschoolers homeschoolers in West Virginia submit those assessments at the end of the year in third, fifth, eighth, and 11th grades. And for the Hope Scholars that are educating their children using ESA monies under the IIP, Individualized Instructional Program, they submit those assessments annually. And so when that is the main distinction, and that could sound super simple, it is not. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but it does create a lot of chaos and confusion for families and especially for county boards. I spoke with a homeschool mom yesterday who said she was vehemently opposed to the Hope Scholarship until she caught just a glimpse of one of my Facebook Lives last year where I said, you know, what's a thread to you might be a rope to someone else, and what is a rope to someone else will be a thread to you. When we talk about government funding and strings being attached, some people are willing to jump through the hoops and submit an assessment every single year for that $4,300. And I am one of those families. So as a traditional homeschooler, I'm willing to submit that assessment. Portfolio reviews can be accepted. So I'm not submitting myself to standardized testing. So there's been a lot of misinformation from traditional homeschool groups who think that it comes with many more hoops than it actually does. So I like to remind people that we can define what hoops we're jumping through, and some of them may be unfeasible for many families. And then lastly, the reason to carve out is to ideally reduce confusion, because our traditional homeschool groups shouldn't have to be well versed in the new Hope Scholarship code as they are in traditional homeschool code. So ideally we carve them out to reduce confusion. So then what are the cons? What are the disadvantages to the carve out? Well, the first one is that you create an entirely new student profile. You create these unbundled educators that are now using ESA funds to educate at home. And who is the OG? Who is the expert in unbundling education? Traditional homeschoolers. And traditional homeschool groups are saying, hey, we serve a distinct community, private pay homeschoolers, where parents are the facilitators of the education. They're privately paying for it. They may outsource, but they make that decision. They use their own money for it. We don't necessarily want to support this new demographic, this new student profile that you're creating that's accepting ESA funding. It creates confusion and overwhelm on us. So we've now created these Hope Scholars using IIP. They have questions about instruction, questions about code, questions about assessment, and they don't actually have any specific group that is now addressing those issues. And that is actually why we founded the West Virginia PUE, Families United for Education, to step in and support those unbundlers who need that expertise and guidance that would come from a traditional homeschooler. Secondly, it creates equal protection issues, or at least it did here in West Virginia. So traditional homeschoolers have fought for diploma protection, sports access, even the right to verify your own address at the DMV when your child needs to take their learner's permit. Years ago, I had to make an in-person appointment with the attendance director at the county in order to get my form verified so that my son could take his learner's test. And thanks to the work of homeschool pioneers in West Virginia, we no longer can do that. We can actually verify our own address so that our children can take those DMV tests. But when we look at the Hope Scholarship Code, where they were carved out, those equal protection issues have come up because they don't necessarily have the same specific code mentions that traditional homeschoolers have. Lastly, in the administration of the program, when we look at the treasurer's office trying to administer this program, it's created a lot of work and overwhelm for them because they are not experts in unbundling education. They do not know how to walk all of these families through assessments. And one thing that I think is notable, since we've already talked about Arizona and even in New Hampshire, I talked with Kate in New Hampshire, who's a powerhouse and does great work there in New Hampshire. And I asked her, how do you serve your families who are using the ESAs at home? And she said that the code basically is mirrored for their homeschoolers and their ESA families. And so they're actually able to direct those families to the traditional homeschool groups. We don't have that in West Virginia. They do have an assessment requirement, but they're able to be supported through the traditional homeschool groups. If you look at Arizona, they don't have that assessment requirement. So right now in West Virginia, over this next week and a half, we have hundreds of families trying to put together assessments for the deadline of June 8th. and they do not have an organization outside of the West Virginia few that is solely organized to meet them where they are and help them navigate that assessment piece. And that's a real issue that we created when we carved them out. And so what are the solutions? What could you possibly do? This would be more in the weeds than we have time for today, but I'm happy to continue the conversation for anyone who wants to reach out. But I do think there's a way to carve out the families who are going to use the funds to educate at home without necessarily lumping them into traditional homeschoolers. And that is to make the ESA a funding mechanism that can be used with any other exemption other than traditional homeschooling. So in West Virginia, we'd still need an alternative, an exemption for those who are educating at home and using ESA funds, but we would make HOPE a funding mechanism and not necessarily an actual exemption. No one is graduating from the Hope Scholarship Program. And secondly, an answer would be to support organizations like the West Virginia Few, Love Your School in Arizona. Pennsylvania has my friend Sharon leading the calls there in supporting families. So we want to make sure that we're supporting organizations that are rising to the challenge of being able to offer expertise, guidance to families who are going to continue to unbundle education using ESA funds. Lastly, and I'll wrap this up, is that you would just lead with listening. To traditional homeschoolers, I would say this: if we truly trust parents, and I've heard these arguments now for nearly 2 decades, all you need to homeschool is a library card. If you can teach your child to walk and talk, surely you can teach them algebra. If we truly believe that about parents, then we need to trust that parents can navigate compliance issues and they can make decisions for themselves when it comes to choosing an ESA or not. And also to traditional homeschoolers, I would just say that we need to remember there are families who may not be in a position to traditionally homeschool and privately pay. And sometimes $4,300 means outsourcing the subjects that they're not comfortable teaching. It may not create the opportunity for a parent to now stay at home and become the full-time educator, but it may create the opportunity for them to outsource instruction. And I think that that's an important note to mention, because many families that are traditionally homeschooling are like, this doesn't even really affect anyone. It's just a drop in the bucket. But that's not true. It really does mean the difference in new families being able to educate at home. And just some points for choice advocates: maybe listen and realize that you are creating work for homeschool organizations. In 2018, when the Cardinal Institute and lawmakers first started talking about ESAs in West Virginia, I personally began getting phone calls, text messages, and emails about the fact that I now thought I deserved money to homeschool my children. And so we do start to ruffle feathers when we're bringing in ESA legislation that can be used at home. You are creating work for traditional homeschool groups, which the majority of are working voluntarily. No one is earning a single penny to do that work that they're doing for traditional homeschoolers. And so many of them are just saying, hey, you're coming over here and you're disrupting what we're doing and you're creating extra work for us. And I think school choice advocates could benefit from listening to traditional homeschoolers instead of just thinking that they're chasing a phantom. The last thing is that many will say we are chasing a phantom. Traditional homeschoolers are super cautious. We're too cautious. Nothing terrible will actually happen. But we saw here in West Virginia this year when a HOPE cleanup bill swiftly moved through both the House Education Committee and the School Choice Senate Committee that would have made traditional homeschoolers code now accept HOPE scholars and ESA fundings in that same section of code. So to everyone who says nothing has happened that gives HSLDA or homeschoolers any reason to be cautious, that's not true. We saw it happen before our very eyes here in West Virginia, and we would do well to learn from that and ensure that it doesn't happen in the future.
Yes, vigilance is always needed, that's for sure. I know Pennsylvania, our rules are stricter than a lot of other states, so we already have to have that vigilance. On the flip side, kind of some of Jamie's concerns about the extra work for homeschoolers, the ESAs can also provide extra opportunities for traditional homeschoolers. And I know that John England in Utah has had a lot of inquiries from people on those lines. So John's going to talk a bit about how Utah's approached it and what he's seeing there from that.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. I appreciate you having us here and having us on and talking about this really important issue. One of the things I really want to mention, and I've had a lot of conversations with Mike and Jamie about this issue, is I'm not actually legally a homeschool dad. There's a program in Utah that we're accepting and we're using, and so I educate my children at home. but I do accept the government money right now, and I'm willing to accept the strings that come attached with that. I think Jamie said it really well. There are strings attached. I work closely with a policy, somebody who was helping us here in Utah, and I listened to her tell people that there are no strings attached, and that's just simply not true. For some people, as Jamie said, they're going to feel like threads, those strings. For some, they're going to feel like ropes, and we have to honor that for those parents and let them make that decision. One of the things as policy workers that we really need to emphasize, and Mike touched on this briefly in his remarks, is the homeschool groups have worked really, really hard for the freedoms that they have. And in states like Utah, those freedoms are immense. I hear Jamie talk about how there's assessments requirements every 3 years. Utah does not have that. Our homeschool group has worked really hard to not have any type of government contact and make that as little as possible in that. And we have to honor that when we're talking about policy and talking about the ways that we can help increase the number of people who maybe choose not to take that traditional public education. I think it's not a secret that most homeschoolers don't like public education. They feel like it's too controlling or whatever it is. I think that's safe to say. I'm new to this kind of community. And so I'll maybe rely more on like a Jamie or a Mike Donnelly to correct me on that. But when I have conversations with them, and we did bring them in, we let them look at the bill language and said, hey, what are your thoughts? We brought in homeschool groups to do that. We said, what are your thoughts? They made some corrections to make sure that it is a legally distinct class in homeschooling versus somebody who takes an ESA in Utah. It is a separate legal distinction so that the homeschoolers can maintain that privacy. They can stay out of things like assessments that if you take the ESA in Utah, you have an assessment that you're required to take. Homeschoolers do not. That is something that we want to maintain and honor, and the work that they've done over the past bunch of years. And so that's something that I think is really important as policy workers as we move forward. But I think it is important to have the conversation as well. If you have a family who is in public school and this ESA does allow them to make a different decision, most homeschoolers will be like, oh yeah, that's probably better than what they're doing currently. And they are supportive in that way. So making those arguments with them, bringing that up and letting them know, like, we don't want to touch what the homeschool laws are. We want to keep you as that distinct class because they do value that freedom from the government meddling in whatever they're doing in regards to their education. And so I'm not sure that I can add much more than what Matt, Jamie, and Mike have already done. They talked a lot on those points, but I will say that, you know, we worked with a homeschool legislator. She homeschooled her parents. We made sure that she was on board with what was going on. Our president at Libertas is a traditional homeschooler. He's homeschooled his kids traditionally for a long time. And so he made sure that he was comfortable with what we were doing. And that is something that we really do want to honor, is that hard work that they have done for their homeschool laws, because they are the original kind of choice advocates. I mean, people have been talking about vouchers and things like that for a long time, but these parents who are homeschooling and have done it traditionally have been working on this for a long, long time, and we do need to honor what they've done.
Great, thanks, John. So now we're going to open up for Q&As. If you could click the little hand raising icon under your reactions, that would make it a lot more orderly. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to do that. Or if any of the panelists have anything that they, you know, thought of during the course of it, you know, please feel free to jump in here.
Well, I'll jump in, Colleen. I didn't say that I was a homeschooling dad, so I feel like I have to disclose that. My wife and I, we have 7 children. We've homeschooled for 26 years now. And, you know, I think this is a really important discussion we're having here. What I'm excited about is how we're making some impact in improving educational opportunity in this country. You know, I have a tagline at the end of my email, which says, "A bright future coming fast, education transformed." I honestly believe that it started with the homeschool community 30, 40 years ago. You have charter schools. You've had you've had micro schools, learning pods, different things. You have ESAs. You have tax credit scholarships. There's so many different kinds of programs, policies supporting different approaches to education. I really think that we are either at the end of the beginning or maybe the beginning of the middle of a significant transformation in education in America. And I'm very excited about that.
Mike, it looks like your former HSLDA colleagues have their hand up, so go ahead there.
Oh, is that Kevin?
Yeah, hi, thank you. Good to see you, Mike. Colin, we've got a daughter at Hillsdale as well, so I appreciate we got a connection there. I guess it's good to see the panel. The question that I have is, the HSLDA perspective has been pretty well known. We're pretty vocal, and it's great to see everybody here and be unified in having this distinct legal carve out, if you will. I'm curious if there's any suggestions from the panel or the group on how to demonstrate to the broader audience that there's actually unity in this approach and that HSLDA is not on an island, if you will. And maybe I'm just on an island myself, but how do we demonstrate that among school choice advocates as a whole, that the approach to carve out a homeschool is broadly recognized and supported beyond more than just my organization and others like Jamie that have kind of advocated for that. So thank you.
I'll take a stab at that one, because I will say that when I joined the school choice space, of which I am new to in what we know as school choice expansion, being a traditional homeschooler, when I joined this space just over the last couple of years, there were questions from traditional homeschoolers that I had sold out, that I was going to the dark side, which I think I may have made that joke for other people as they have come along, but that I had really sold out the traditional homeschool community by joining in this. So I do think that you're bringing up a good point, in that the public opinion, if you will, is that we are divided on this issue. And I think that the way we can address that is to have not just conversations like these, but I know I've hosted these. I have clients in several states. I'm meeting with Holly from New York later today to have a conversation on Zoom about how you can interact with traditional homeschoolers and how you can bring awareness and communication to them so that they understand. One thing that I recognized of learning about the Hope Scholarship was being able to define specifically what strings are attached. At the very first homeschool day at the Capitol, after Hope Scholarship was passed, I had a table. I was answering questions, and traditional homeschoolers were under a variety of different impressions that Hope Scholarship required things that it simply didn't require. So I think that education is key, meeting families where they are, offering invitations to statewide homeschool organizations to have conversations. And I think that you need to find the other Jamies in other states, traditional homeschoolers who are open to this conversation, who are willing to accept ESA funding and say that it can be beneficial for their families, and then be able to foster those conversations saying, yeah, you can talk to HSLDA. They're in agreement that the carve out is an option that works and can benefit both demographics.
And to piggyback on what Jamie just said, that is one thing that we did do. We actually had one of our homeschool advocates from Utah, and I think it's important to talk to the ones specific in those states, because homeschool laws do vary from state to state quite greatly. But we did have one come up and promote our ESA. And so if you're a policy worker like I am, that's a super powerful thing to have for the legislators, because they do get concerned when they have their constituents who are homeschoolers reaching out to them and saying, hey, this is going to infringe on my homeschool rights. If you have people out there who are looking at the policy from a homeschooler's perspective, I think that's a great thing to do as well. And anybody who's trying to push one of these policies would do well to reach out to HSLDA and get their opinion on the law and make sure that those carve-outs are strong for the homeschool community.
I just thought one thing, Mike, if you'll let me add one thing to that before I hand it over. But, many families like mine who are willing to accept ESA funding are in hiding because they are scared of traditional homeschoolers and the protests that could come out. And so they're not always so willing to even poke their head out and ask questions. So I think that if we could start this conversation with many traditional homeschoolers, and I'm sure Micah and those at HSLDA would be able to help with that, to have these conversations, then you would see many more families coming to the table saying, we actually would like to take advantage of that. But often the opposition from traditional homeschoolers is just too loud, and many families are going to shy away from that.
Yeah, that opposition is driven by the fact that the traditional and the original, we'll say the original homeschooling community is not consulted in policy design and legislative design. That's a tough one, Kevin, because, there are some model policies out there. ALEC, I've put the link in the chat, has a model policy that codifies, if you will, this approach. But not all legislators, not all bill drafters follow that. Legislative design is a chaotic thing sometimes. And so I think all of us in the policy advocacy area need to work harder at telling our champions that if they want to have trouble passing the bill with the homeschool community, don't follow this approach, right? Or if you want it to go through without difficulty, follow this approach. In Utah, it was a quick fix. You guys dealt with it early on and it went through. Iowa, they had already figured it out a couple of years ago, so it went through. Arkansas figured it out. Florida, it was a bit of a challenge. There was a lot of back and forth that was going on there. That's the legislative process we have in a constitutional republic. But those of us who are advocating for policy, especially our SPN affiliates, and I know that they were invited to this, and lots of other people, if you hear of an ESA bill moving, raise your hand and say, hey, have you guys checked with the homeschoolers? Because they can be a real speed bump. Okay. And there's a way to deal with this. This is not difficult. This is an easy thing to do. It is very easy to design this policy to work. You just set it up according to the model policy, Alex policy, separate exemption, and people choose, I'm going to be an ESA, I'm going to be a homeschool, and we're done. It's easy. And it doesn't prevent anyone from being able to sign up and get the money if they want it. And it protects this community of people who have worked very hard over the years to have nothing to do with the government. I think, Jamie, you were talking about the phantom. You dispelled the phantom, but let me tell you something. A lot of people like to point to Europe. And, in Europe, a lot of places, the money follows the child. Okay, but they also have the requirement that private schools use state certified teachers, they use state approved curriculum, and they take state exams. Okay, that is the concern that I have about the government funding education generally. I mean, I don't know how many people on this call were opposed to Obamacare. I was. It's the same thing. When the government throws a bunch of money at something and then they control it and they crowd out all the private interests, it's a problem. And so that's the concern that the homeschool community has. I think it's a valid one. And I think that the policy designers, the bill drafters, and legislators need to take that in consideration. And, well, I'll stop there.
And I do think things like this, like just to make sure that the people that work on these policies and the homeschool groups are all aware of it. And hopefully stuff like this helps. Jennifer Wolverton, your hand is up. If you could just tell us where you're from, maybe too, and then go ahead with your question.
Hey, can you hear me? Hey, I'm from Alabama, and I'm a homeschool mom. I'm a special ed mom, and I'm independently lobbying right now for our price bill that's going through Alabama. My question for you guys today is specifically for Alabama. I'm having a hard time connecting with people who can really help us because we seem to have no real true homeschool law in Alabama. So for us to separate, like you're saying, the kids out as ESA scholars, I think that's going to be really difficult in our state. So if the homeschool law is broken or doesn't exist, we actually have, because of that, a poor relationship with HSLDA. So I'm not sure how we would, that would be my first choice to reach out to, hey, how can we work on this? But I would say a majority of our homeschoolers struggle with our relationship with HSLDA. So fixing our law first might be the first thing that we have to do in our state. I don't know. We have a ton of special ed kids too that I know would benefit from this. So the price bill is coming through. I think actually, ironically, today is the day it might die in our state house. So I'm watching all that going on right now. But if anyone here has any ideas on how Alabama could reach out to certain people and work on our advocacy of our current state bill or law for homeschoolers, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
So one thing I would recommend, if you don't mind, sorry, Jamie, talking over you.
No, go ahead.
One thing I would recommend is there are groups just like the Libertas Institute in Utah that are SPN affiliates in every state. You can reach out to them. Most of them are working on education, not all of them, but they will have contacts within your state to change your law. I think that's a wonderful thing. Making those homeschool laws stronger and more distinct is, I think, a wonderful thing. And it's something that, you know, at least us at Libertas Institute would totally support, and we would want to work with a parent who is looking to do that. So I would start, if you go to spn.org, you can search for the think tanks, the political think tanks in your state, and you can find people who are in Alabama specifically that understand Alabama law. They have relationships with the legislature typically, and would be probably better able to help you than I would, for sure.
I'll hop in and say that Jennifer actually found me on Facebook, and I can't remember how it was, Jennifer, but we worked here a couple months ago, and that was what the first piece of advice that I had for her was to reach out to her SPN affiliate, to reach out to her traditional homeschool groups and find out who was already working on legislation, who was involved in this, to connect with the amazing team through the school choice, national school choice work that are already in the state and working. But I think specifically what Jennifer is running into is there isn't really a designated definition. So I don't know if Mike has anything to add to that. I will say I learned very quickly in Idaho, where the Idahoans were like, no, we have nothing to contribute to this conversation because we're not defined here. And so to carve us out, you would have to first define us. And so that was really what we were running into when I was in Idaho working with some parents on the ground there. So that's all I have to contribute to that.
Well, I know it's actually not that difficult. If you create a separate exemption, you know, that confines the ESA student to that section, it doesn't affect the homeschoolers, even if they're not defined by state law. It is challenging in states where there is no clear definition, so you can't exclude them in a sense. But as long as you are cabining the ESA into its own separate category, then people opt in. And so in Oregon, there were other challenges. I'm sorry, Idaho. In Idaho, there were some other challenges as well. You know, to your point, Jamie, I mean, it's true. There is a very strong group in the original homeschool community who are very much against any government money coming into private education because of the concern about creep. And that was a problem in Idaho. So I think that, you know, as we are having this conversation in America about how we can improve education, we need a real marketplace, and we don't have that right now. More people need more options. Homeschooling is, you know, a great option, and anyone can do it. And honestly, you know, it's not that expensive. You know, people think it's expensive, and you know, the VELA fund was funding many education entrepreneurs, and they have a report called Open for Business, which shows that it's not expensive to create these permissionless, out-of-system learning environments. And homeschooling isn't that expensive either. So the truth is, you don't need $6,000, $7,000, $4,000 to homeschool. You can do it. It may mean you have to make some choices. Okay, that's fine. Not saying that people shouldn't get the money, but you don't actually need it, and that's what the research shows. So people who want to choose to do something different can.
I would say, as a traditional homeschooler, you know, obviously I've chosen this now for going on 17 years. I was never the homeschool mom who only needed the library card. I was never that mom. So there were choices that we made. There were sacrifices that we made to do it. Having a child now with some special needs that has therapies that he's going to need, I will say that there are many families who I think need representation, and they need someone. And Jennifer, I know that this is special to your heart. That's why I believe so much in the work you're doing in Alabama, that these families need representation, and they need someone to remind traditional homeschoolers that for some families, the difference of $4,000 means outsourcing some instruction or some support that they didn't have previously. So I do think that for many families, this is creating opportunity where there wasn't any. And that's really, to me, the heart of school choice expansion, is that we are providing opportunity, creating it in spaces where traditionally it wasn't there, or it was harder to achieve. So I think that we can do that. And it's good to see you, Jennifer. I'm glad you made it on the call.
We want to give Courtney a chance to ask her question. And Courtney, also, if you could just let us know where you're calling from or coming in from, that'd be great.
I am from Florida. I'm in the Northwest Florida region of Florida, and really just wanted to comment on what someone had asked is about connecting to your local leaders. I came out in 2022 seeing an intense need in our region because of the influx of new homeschoolers to sort of unify for a cause of information. And so I was accidentally poised ahead of the legislation that has, oh gosh, given me a full-time job that pays me no dime that I didn't really mean to have. And I will say, I cringed as that bill was coming through. There were original language in it that I thought, did they ever even talk to anyone from homeschooling? Because this is just not going well. And at the same time, because we are a low income area, I knew that there were families here that had gone through desperate times trying to get their kids out of school, having to make really hard financial choices. And I'll give you an example of myself. I'm capable of making a 6-figure income. I've homeschooled for 10 years traditionally. I did so because I have a special needs oldest child that just could not get what he needed in a system. It has been incredibly hard to be a hard mom. Incredibly hard. I could show you the things I've had to do to keep this going. And most of that has been to build my community so that we could sustain each other. And I have lots of very low income families that ride the wave with me, and this is how we do it. And so I'm just saying that might not be a view from some of us that really do have to live differently because we're desperate to bring that child along in the fair chance that they need. But I will say, I did see where you've got so much misinformation that this negative trail and negative narrative happens unnecessarily without people being included in just talking. I do feel that there's lots to talk about, and that there's a reason to protect traditional homeschooling. We know our history as homeschoolers. We know the history of homeschooling in our state. And in my lifetime, you couldn't even be a homeschooler without being in the umbrella schools, as they call them. Now, that's not the type of schooling I am, but I'm just here to say that there's a lot to talk about. And it seems like Florida didn't have to argue quite as much as they did. And the few representatives that I saw that came from the homeschooling community did not represent the full community. There's a harsh collide of secular and faith-based homeschoolers, especially in the Panhandle. I can't say exactly that that's in other areas. So in order to represent some unity, there has to be just a focus on education in order to be trusted in this environment that I'm in. I actually reached out to our larger organizations to get support. And I think what they're not recognizing is that the mere fact that they have Christian basis at the root of their organizations, which I fully understand, has a lot to do with why half of the population will not even partner with them in conversations. So I think that that may not be the case in other states, but for Florida, I think we missed some things with not understanding that the homeschool world itself has much diversity, and that has to be taken into consideration when you're getting information from the homeschool community, that you can't just say, oh, I consulted a homeschool mom. That's not going to cut it. You really need a panel of types of homeschoolers to really get a good feel for the many, many reasons people are homeschooling and the ways that they go about it. And that really at the root of homeschooling is always a worldview. That's where you kind of go to protect it.
Right. I mean, I guess it comes down to it's impossible to satisfy everybody, but Mike wants to talk about an approach that they're using in Oklahoma, which might come close to that.
Well, one of the things about ESAs is, as we're learning, is they're actually very difficult to implement. When we do an ESA, what we're doing is creating an entirely new government program. Show me one that's gotten smaller over time and gotten less intrusive, and I'll buy you dinner at a good steakhouse. Okay. But Oklahoma may have come up with something, and I'm excited about what Oklahoma has done. Maybe this might be an easier way to help those people that Jamie wants to help and that Courtney was talking about, because look, we're a compassionate society. We want people to have options, and as a society, we're also very generous. And we have a very big welfare state. But if we're going to do that, we should do it efficiently. And one way that HSLDA has supported is tax credits. And I'm not speaking for HSLDA, but I know when I was there, tax credits was a big thing that we preferred to see, broad-based education tax credits, because when you do tax credits, you're just letting people keep more of their own money. And there are different accountability mechanisms that are fairly straightforward. But Oklahoma just passed the largest parent education tax credit ever. Up until that time, about 8 states had tax credit programs for homeschooling or private schools, pretty small. Oklahoma's is very big. The nice thing about a tax credit is it's very easy to implement. What you're seeing around the country, and maybe Matt can jump in here. He's been quiet. Matt, let me pull you into this if I could. I'm catching you off guard maybe, but in Arizona, there's a lot of debate right now about fraud and abuse, right? We can talk about trusting parents, but at the end of the day, if the state's giving people money or giving them a debit card, and they're buying stuff that certain people who are in control don't like, whether it's a chicken coop or a trampoline, I don't think there's anything wrong with people buying trampolines, chicken coops. And when I took my kids to SeaWorld on a vacation, it was very educational. Now, I'm okay with, not spending money on flights and, things like that, but I think we can figure this out, okay, even in the ESA context. But when you're doing tax credits, you don't have to worry about it as much. You give the people the money, or you let them keep their money, and you're done. Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up, Mike. I mean, I think it's a great point, and obviously different states, as you said, Arizona has had a tax credit scholarship program, a little bit different from this. This is kind of taking that model and saying, instead of saying, here are the things you're allowed to buy with it via an ESA, it's sort of, you're opting out of the system, we're going to give you financial assistance. As you said, in Arizona, there are conversations about what should be an allowable expense. And the department here, the way the program works essentially is, families either make an expense through the system and it kind of goes through a portal, or they pay it with a debit card and get a reimbursement afterwards. And so I think those are good conversations to basically say, hey, what's the most efficient way to run this? Is it that each expense is then looked at? Is it that expenses are audited? Is it that we're giving you a bucket and trusting you and within categories? I think those are all like good operational questions to have. And the Oklahoma approach seems promising. To that point, one of the things I was actually going to say that John and Jamie, you brought up, there's this question about strings being attached to the ESA program as opposed to homeschool. The strings that are in West Virginia would have us in Arizona up in arms.
Sure.
It is harder to be a homeschool student. There's more strings being a homeschool student there in West Virginia than being an ESA student in Arizona, right? So things that you guys are used to in the homeschool community and say, look, we've won these victories. If that came to us, we would all flip out and say, what are you doing? Now this is clearly the camel's nose under the tent, right? So I would almost say we get caught up on these distinctions of saying ESA versus homeschool. And again, I think keeping that legal distinction is useful for the various reasons we've talked about, and having a backstop should there ever be, if people say, hey, look, the ESA program, they're trying to undermine it, to have that additional safety boat to me seems just as a good approach to have both of those. But this idea that, well, the ESA program, isn't true and you're submitting to these things, but we're fine being homeschoolers over here and submitting to them. I just think that's an important part of the conversation. There's nothing inherent in the ESA model that says you're okay with strings, right? Any more than in the homeschool model. If you say, look, I'm agreeing you're going to leave me alone, and I will submit to you 3 times over the course of my kids' education what they've learned or a status update, right? So I think that that's an important part. And to Mike's comment about the Oklahoma program, I think those are great questions, and the different designs of the programs. If that's a direction that things move, I think that there's like, this is the beauty of, as you said, right, the federalist system, where each state can go in and say, look, we don't have the feds telling us how we have to do this. Arizona can be one approach, West Virginia can be another, Oklahoma can be another, and let's see what works best, what's most efficient, and over time, maybe that you all move in one direction. But I think that's the successful model.
I would say,
and I would add, go ahead, Jamie. I spoke first last time.
I would just say one thing on the tax credits, because, it requires that upfront, so as a family that has lived this long on one income and one vehicle family, in order to sacrifice to homeschool, the tax credits would require the family to demonstrate receipts and to put that money up front. And there could be arguments on why that's good and why that's bad. But I would just say, in some states, if that's not a win to you, I would love to be a part of your conversation on an ESA model that is more of a win for families like mine that benefit from the actual $4,300 in the ESA versus a tax credit. Because I think for some families, the $1,000 tax credit isn't necessarily a win. So there are many partial solutions, but I think that that's the freedom that we have here to discuss the many variety of partial solutions and how many families we can impact with the different solutions that we can offer.
I know we're coming to time, Colleen, but just on Jamie's point, John, forgive me for butting in. The Oklahoma tax credit, I think, is like $7,500.
For homeschoolers, it's $1,000.
For homeschoolers, $1,000. But, there's a way to deal with that, which is refundable tax credits. And that's something that I think, some people, I know some people would like to have that conversation, and there's some complication in design. Is it means tested, in terms of, you qualify for this tax credit if you make this amount of money or not, and if it's refundable if you're under the poverty line or whatever it is. But, there is a way to help people who truly need help. And, in terms of implementation, is a tax credit easier to implement than an ESA? I mean, this is great. There's so many different approaches. Let's try a bunch of different ones, as Matt said, see what works.
And I was just going to add on to that, Mike, as well. It's iterations, right? We start off with saying vouchers for private schools, right? Now we move into ESAs where, the parent gets a lot more control. And I would say that with these policies, the main point is that so long as the government is funding public education, parents should have some say in how that money is spent. Now, if we want to start having conversations, which I think Mike would enjoy, about not funding public education at all, then maybe we can have that conversation. But right now, the state governments fund public schools, and they've had a monopoly. Still over 90% of parents are using the public system. And so if we can start creating a marketplace, and that's what these ESAs do. I mean, I've had lots of conversations from people who are coming in with very innovative models and want to start in Utah because we did pass something. That's good for education. I'm not saying it's a perfect solution, but it's a better solution than what we currently have.
I think we're going to end on that note. Thank you for the panelists for joining us. I think the big takeaway for me is that this is a conversation that needs to continue, because this is an issue we're facing all over the place. And while there are troubles with it, it's also very exciting. So thanks everybody for joining us. Some of our emails are in the chats, and feel free to reach out if you have any other questions. So, thank you.